want to encourage participants who are joining us here to use the Q&A function. So if you have any questions, please post them on the under Q&A, and then make sure to upvote also your favorite questions, and we'll try to get to them. And if there are any questions we don't answer now, we can actually go to Slack, and Dr. Sadler can engage with them there. So I want to start with the question. I really like the question, or the idea of complex causality, as someone that is trained in psychology, human science, and that teaches research, because of course, in the mainstream scientific tradition, causality is related to two other concepts. Linearity tends to be kind of unidirectional. A causes B, right? You want to really isolate variables and factors to really determine for sure the cause. And if you can't do that, then it's not experimental, it's not scientific, it's something that's less, it's not theory, it's not fact. You can say it's a correlation, you can say it's a hypothesis, but you can't determine that it's a theory or a fact. The other notion I think that's related to it as well is temporality, right? Time is a big part of it. And I think when I was listening to your talk, I was Aristotle's notion of final causality came to mind as a kind of more interesting approach to causation. And so if you can speak to that a little bit, the scientific approach and the experimental approach specifically of trying to isolate variables to produce a theory or a fact, and what you're talking about.
Yeah, and so I'll also say that we can bring in sort of, the way that philosophy tends to treat causality and the way that policymakers tend to treat it. And I would say that there's a tendency towards abstraction and oversimplification in all of this, right? Policymakers like there to be things that they can not necessarily say are scientific in the social science way, but at least can sell to a public and say, oh, this is causing this. So for example, the virus has caused the economy to close down, and that is causing people to be out of work, which is putting them at risk. And so we have to reopen this vast thing called the economy, which is really an abstraction. And yeah, in the social sciences, I understand why there's this impulse to try to be able to say we have a very rigorous approach to these sorts of things, but reality is complex. And when we're dealing with crises, which this conference is about, I think we have to be aware that there is a vast, complex causal nexus behind a lot of these things, and crises don't just get caused by some independent variable that wasn't sufficiently attended to. It's usually caused by a whole host of things that often interact with each other in complicated ways. But it often reveals, as we're seeing in this COVID crisis, particularly here in America, that there are many other crises that get sort of absorbed into it. And can that be handled effectively in the ways that would satisfy the desires of social scientists? Perhaps not. Or it can be done in a very piecemeal way. I think that approach that's been taken in terms of looking at things as syndemics is quite useful, and that does come out of social science as well as medicine. I think I lost the train of some of the second part of what you're asking.
A follow-up would be another word that came to mind as you were talking is reasoning, because reasoning and causality, like causality for me has this very specific connotation that has to do with, like A causes B, whereas reasoning, I think, an interesting alternative.
Yeah, and I'll introduce a couple other terms too. Deliberation is also important there. And then reflexivity. Human beings, and this, this is not something new that I'm saying. This has been said by people like Alistair McIntyre and other people who've looked very closely at the social sciences. One of the issues one of the difficulties with the social sciences is that we're dealing with subjects that are reflexive. As soon as they start realizing that you're studying them, they resist that or subvert it in different ways. And they can also like use the information that's coming to them and then reassess things. And deliberation is something that we do as individuals, like should I go and buy more toilet paper or not, seems like we're running out. Or we can do it in more public ways. And deliberation involves reasoning, not always necessarily good reasoning or well founded reasoning, but reasoning nonetheless. And we are, if we think about this in philosophical anthropology ways, we are the rational animal, the logikate zoon, as Aristotle said. And so we do reason these things out with all of this input coming in from other things, including the emotions. And the other side of that is that we are the communicative animal. So when I see you reasoning about something, I can pick up that line of reasoning and say, this is pretty good. Or I can respond to it and say, well, that guy's terrible. I need to, flame him in some way and call out his horrible reasoning, or anything in between. So yeah, maybe those are better ways to talk about it than causality. But I wanted to use this term causality because there is indeed a vast causal set of nexuses that are connected together. And in philosophy, when we talk about causality, and I think you can say a similar thing in the social sciences, we are, as we're investigating it, we are wrapping our heads around things, complex phenomena that we want to be able to react to, make decisions in terms of. And so there's a kind of intelligibility as we penetrate further into the causality and resist the temptation to oversimplify.
Thank you for that. And did you ever like think about Aristotle's notion of final causality?
Hmm.
Because I think it's interesting to think of how
Yes.
he's not thinking A before B, that's the cause, but that the cause could be future oriented. That's something that's kind of pulling, as
Yeah.
opposed to pushing, right? So that's
Yeah.
interesting to think about too.
And I'll say that works in ways that can be very useful for us, and it also works in ways that are causing problems. So one way of oversimplifying causality in this crisis is to attribute motives to other people, which we have to do, because otherwise human actions are um, unintelligible. But the people who are saying, for example, well, this is really a vast government conspiracy to get us to wear masks and social distance and have power over us, they're attributing a kind of final causality to things, right? The crisis, which has been going on for a while, is really being pulled in this future plan direction, which I mean, is it possible that actually could have been the case, that there's a vast conspiracy? Sure. Is it probable in any way? I think not. But we can also talk about other things that fit in more with what I was discussing before. So if you think about, if we switch back to the Indiana example, where they started talking in terms of syndemics, when you have a drug abuse epidemic and you're trying to produce programs and legislation and policies that are going to fix things, you're looking towards the future. There is a purpose, an end, a telos that's in mind. And it becomes this, unfortunately, in cases like this, a game of whack-a-mole when you're dealing with the most vulnerable, because as it turns out, there's all sorts of other things that are impinging on them, dealing with trauma and violence, mental illness, generational poverty, lack of job opportunities, and those, also affect the person. So if we can think about how, we don't have to think in a utopian way of like, oh, we're going to solve all of humankind's problems at once, but we think about, okay, we've got a problem with this, and we've got a problem with this, and we've got a problem with this, and we need to plan out teleologically how we're going to deal with those sorts of things. So we're actually addressing the problems across a broad spectrum in ways, by the way, that are going to be messy and not satisfy a lot of policymakers and social scientists. Then I think we could actually start to do things for those who are more vulnerable.
Okay, here's a question from one of the participants. How can we call for solidarity in Globo when the communities that are most affected by crises, for example, in a past tense, the HIV crisis, are insufficiently solid, for lack of better words, in and of themselves? And if such solidarity can be acquired or developed, how do we maintain that condition?
Well, I don't think solidarity is etymologically connected with solid. So that I don't think that's something that we have to take as a real objection. But one of the challenges in um, exhibiting solidarity, which is a relative term, it's not something like an on-off switch. It's going to be, we can have more or less of it. Um, there would have to be a lot of for many people sort of like reaching out and figuring out what's going on in particular communities and happening to particular people, and we often do this in terms of looking at representative cases. So for example, on Twitter, and unfortunately I don't know the woman's name because there's so many cases like this popping up, but there was a recent thing about an African-American nurse who was shot in a botched police raid. And, she's been one of the people on the front line in the COVID epidemic. And then you see that the crisis that we're having in policing impinges upon her because she's unfortunately in one of the, when it comes to policing, one of the most vulnerable populations or groups, right? How can we have solidarity? I mean, we can have solidarity in part by saying something needs to change here. We can have solidarity by going out as best as we can into communities by advocating. I don't think that we have to try to change everything. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting, Robert, you mentioned the factor of time. None about who we're going to try to engage in or exhibit solidarity with, and will inevitably leave out far more people than we will manage to help. That does not mean that we're not doing something that's good or fulfills a moral obligation on our part, because the real good that you manage to do is actual, it's real. And it won't solve everything, but at least it's something.
Thank you. Here's another question from participant. What tools or strategies do you suggest to promote complex thinking on these issues, for example, in a
Mm.
classroom?
Oh, in the classroom, that's an interesting twist on it. I mean, we do case studies in ethics classes, and I think it's kind of a common model for like business classes and also for medical things. And good case studies are usually going to be messy and murky, and you have the students do a first pass at them, and some of them come up with very quick answers, and then you start digging into it to figure out why those answers are only partly right. That's just one of many different things you could do. I'm not saying that's the one approach that you would have. I think that teaching something about the informal fallacies can actually be quite helpful, or as they get called in other places, cognitive biases, right? These ways in which reasoning, particularly practical reasoning about what we ought to do or ought not to do, can go astray. Many of them, when we diagram them out, turn out to be based on oversimplifications and not attending sufficiently to things. So, I mean, those are just a few suggestions. I don't know that we could actually work out an entire curriculum that would be applied across the board for this, but it's kind of an interesting prospect to think about.
I feel also like tapping into the collective um, mind of the students, and
Yeah.
dialogically, that's part of you know tapping into that complexity as well.
Yeah, getting students
Here's
to learn from each other through engaging each other, right? Yeah.
Yes, and here's another question: how do we go about encouraging people to take serious such a duty to be informed, which seems to be essential to community life?
Oh, that is a really good question. Some people do take that seriously already, and so I think we don't have to worry about them, except for the ones who are very selectively informed, right? The ones who say, "Well, you have to do your own research," but it turns out their research is only looking at this very narrow spectrum, and maybe we want to get them to look at more things that would expand their horizons that way. That is a tough one. I think this is one of those cases where the old expression, consistent pressure relentlessly applied, plays in. We don't have one single set of things or approaches that we take. We just keep saying, here's some more information. This is important. And it is tough because we are within an attention economy. which tends to favor either the trivial or the easily schematized over the more complex stuff. So I don't want to say we're always going to be fighting a losing battle, but we're always going to be certainly coming from behind when it comes to that.
Here's another question from the community. How do you think the treatment of U.S. prison inmates during our COVID crisis reflects on the ethics of the government? Do you think the treatment of inmates versus treatment of the non-prison constituency have taken parallels?
Yeah, this is a very big problem, and I do want to say something that I mentioned within the presentation. We have no prison system here in the United States. Instead, we have a federal prison system, which does not house most of our inmates. Then we have 50 different state departments of corrections, each of which is its own animal. Some of which are particularly horrific. And then we have all of these county jail systems as well. Cook County jail system is larger than some state DOCs. And what you can say is that there, at least in my experience, I've never seen a particularly well-managed prison system. It's just, how poorly managed they are and how many problems there are. You're also dealing with infrastructure that often tends to be quite old and not well maintained. Like when I was teaching at Indiana State Prison, you could smell mold everywhere. It's one of the oldest prisons in Indiana. And I thought, man, if I had a mold allergy, I would be in hell living here. And so we've got all that sort of stuff in the background. Now, we also have a legal system that unfortunately is a system, but it tends to really disfavor treating prisoners the way that we ought to, in part because we put people into jails awaiting trial, which can go on for a very long time because prosecutors can use it as leverage with people. We're just gonna leave you here for a couple months, get you to plead to a lower offense. And then when people ought to be released from prisons, very often the state, it's usually the local prosecutors will try to resist that as much as possible in order to appear tough on crime. So right now we have not only do we have the usual inequities and poor management that we had already, but we literally have people who are being given the potentiality of a death sentence, even though they haven't been convicted because they're stuck in Rikers Island or in Cook County Jail, or even in our jails here in Wisconsin, about which it's very difficult to get any information about COVID, by the way, in the Wisconsin DOC and jail systems. So, this is a major problem. Does it parallel what's going on the outside? I would say it's much worse in many respects. But the prison system is part of the criminal justice system, which also fits into this entire discussion of vulnerabilities and which people are more disadvantaged. Here in Milwaukee, one of the most segregated large cities in the United States, we can say that the brunt of policing falls on minorities, and the criminal justice system, and therefore the prison system, and the spread of COVID within the prison system is going to impact the African American community and on the South Side, the Hispanic community much more heavily than the larger community. So it's a little bit of a long-winded answer, I think, but there's a lot more to be said about the prison issue, I think.
I do have a question about complexity, because I personally love complexity, and this is kind of a more general question.
You are in the minority then.
Right, right. And you talked about leadership in the end, and
yeah,
I always think about human organization, particularly because when you look at the environment that we're situated in, and when you look at the universe as a whole, it's this big context, the cosmos. It's complex, right? And
yeah,
we are complex, and yet human beings create these hierarchical, simplistic structures that are very rigid and not complex, right? And complexity, we know when you study complex systems, they're actually much more flexible, they adapt
yeah,
better, and they're
yeah,
much more sustainable, so they last longer. When you create a hierarchical, rigid system, let's say where the power is just concentrated like a pyramid all the way to the top, that kind of system Sure, it gives you a high on power, but it doesn't last long. It's not sustainable and it's not efficient. So this kind of um, I think about a lot about this, and I want your thought on this. Why human beings do not just align themselves with how the universe is organized and create complex systems that actually would last better, would be more efficient, more democratic, all of
Yeah,
that.
that's a big question. um, so I would say that for one thing, the sort of rigid hierarchized systems are also drawing upon all sorts of complex systems to support them. And the question is whether there's any attentiveness to that. So, a great example of this is the discourse right now about reopening the economy. When people say that, I often kind of tune them out at this point because I'm like, the economy never closed. You just can't go to the barber like you'd like to, or shop in the Costco in the way that you'd prefer to, without a mask, and lingering over items and touching everything, and that sort of thing. Because there are vast sectors of the economy that are going like gangbusters. Construction is a prime example. We live right here downtown in Milwaukee, and the one thing that hasn't stopped and has actually increased is construction, in part because it's a great way for the city and the county to keep spending money and put it into the hands of people who are going to spend the money and keep the economy going. So there's the reality, the complex reality of all these interlocking systems, and then there's the sort of ideological representation, which tends to be oversimplistic. And I was joking that you're in the minority in preferring complexity, but that's quite true. Most people do like for things to be nice and simple because it's manageable. It reduces anxiety and the feeling that we don't really know what the hell's going on. I mean, that's the thing too with complex systems. We only know like bits of what's happening over here, and we have to make sort of educated guesses, which could be wrong, which is less attractive than coming down from on high and having the great leader who's going to tell us exactly how things are going to work, whether it be, um, you know, uh, and I don't want to get too much into politics here, but sort of a leader who kind of makes it up as he goes along, or a technocrat like Obama was, or somebody who's much more of a allowing the cabinet to do the job like George Bush was, or things along those lines. Um, to exercise leadership in today's situation, I think would require being very attentive to these complexities. And like I said, there has to be a not a sort of like Bill Clinton-esque, oh, I feel your pain, or and I think it's quite difficult for people who have leadership positions to genuinely identify and exhibit solidarity towards those who are most vulnerable, because they are taken out of those situations by having been gone up that hierarchy in leadership, even if they came from humble beginnings. But I think that is an ethical imperative that they ought to be. If they're not themselves looking at things in a way that at least goes to the tip of the iceberg of the complexity, at least the people surrounding them who they take advice from ought to be doing so. And so we're in a particularly bad situation here in the States, I think. Um, and we're in a bad situation here in the States too, because of our particular emphasis on federalism and local control, because some of our governors are doing a great job, others are doing terrible jobs. Some of our mayors exhibiting leadership are doing as good a job as can be done in this situation, and others are going for easy solutions that are not going to be helpful for not just for us as a whole, but particularly for those who are already disadvantaged.
I also like that you use the word leader because the leader for me is someone that leads by example. So I literally
Mm,
think of a leader that's on the front line, that exposing themselves to danger, to kind
yeah,
of not just someone that's sitting comfortably and telling people what to do, which is the boss model, right? So I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that the word leader is a really important one because you're literally at the forefront, right? You're the vanguard, and so I think that's an important thing to emphasize.
I think that's right, and I think that's very well put. I don't have anything to add to that one.
All
We
right,
prob-
so we're almost close to the end. Do you have any final thoughts or any questions from the participants?
well, I mean, I want to thank all of you for inviting me to this. This is really a great thing to put on, and I think it's very helpful that it's recorded because we can use this now um, in our classes and spread it much more widely. These sets of discussions and interdisciplinary conferences like this are particularly helpful, I think.
No, thank you very much. We really appreciated your keynote and the Q&A. So hopefully you'll engage with the participants on Slack.
Yeah, I'll see if I can get to it. I may be a little bit slow because I'm still in the middle of grading, which is one of the worst
Right,
things about being an instructor. But it's very important, right? Giving
right.
feedback to the students. I don't know anybody who likes grading, except for people who like to give bad grades. But um, we've all had professors like that.
Right, right.
Um, but it is, and actually that's kind of a good thing to go out on. So I've talked a lot about the nature of crises and complexity and causality, and then, these sort of ethical and leadership dimensions, but communicative dimensions are really important. Being able to, give each other feedback. I think you've got this wrong. I think you left this out. And then being able to take that and bring that in. That's sort of like what you're talking about. A leadership might be, framed in more democratic terms.
Thank you very much.